Dakota Territory, 1875, and the first hard snow came down off the plains in the last week of October, early and mean, burying the Briggs Range under 8 inches of white before the last of the calves had even been weaned. Sadie Colby came to the ranch house door with 2 children behind her skirts and a letter of reference from the Bismarck Mercantile in her cold hand, answering an advertisement for a cook that had been posted at the general store for a week and answered by no one, because the Briggs outfit ran 40 head of hands through a hard winter and word had gotten round that the last cook had quit in September, worn thin by the size of the crew and the shortness of the season's pay. "I can cook for 40 as easy as 4, ma'am," Sadie told the housekeeper who answered the door, a spare older woman named Mrs. Wick, who looked her over with the particular assessing eye of someone who had seen a great many desperate widows come through that door in her time. "I ran my husband's store books for 6 years before the fever took him last spring, and I've fed a crew of drovers on my father's outfit in Nebraska before that. I've got 2 children and a winter with no roof of our own coming. And I'll work harder than any cook you've had if you'll give me the chance to prove it." Mrs. Wick looked at the 2 children. A boy of 9, solemn and watchful, and a girl of 6 clutching her brother's coat sleeve, and something in her weathered face softened despite herself. "The wage is $20 a month and board for the 3 of you, and it's hard work, feeding this crew through a Dakota winter. You'll be up before 4 and abed after 9 most days, and there's no easing into it. You start tomorrow, if you're still willing." "I'm willing," said Sadie Colby, and meant it with the whole of what little she had left. She met Lucas Briggs on her second morning, though she did not learn his name for 3 weeks, because he did not offer it and no one else troubled to, and by the time she thought to ask, she had already decided he was simply another hand. He was tall and quiet, 38 or thereabouts, with a weathered face and hands scarred from a decade of rope work, and he came through the cookhouse line each evening dead last, after every other man on the outfit had filled his plate, and took whatever remained without complaint, standing to eat it near the stove rather than claiming a seat at the long table where the other hands sat crowded together telling the day's stories. "That one there?" Sadie asked the crew's cheerful young cowhand. Dell, on her 3rd evening, nodding toward the quiet man at the stove. "Does he not care for company at the table? Lucas? Nah, he's just quiet-natured. Been here longer than most of us. Does the hardest jobs without being asked. And never once complains if the food's run thin by the time he gets to it." Dell grinned, spooning more stew onto his own plate. "Good man to have around in a hard winter, ma'am. Never says 2 words when one'll do. But he'll ride out in a blizzard after a lost calf when the rest of us are still working up the nerve." Sadie began, without quite deciding to, setting aside a plate for him each evening, keeping it warm at the back of the stove where the heat lingered longest, so that whatever remained of the crew's supper reached him hot rather than the cold scraped-together leavings he had evidently grown accustomed to expecting. He noticed it the 2nd week and said nothing about it directly, only met her eyes once across the crowded cookhouse with an expression of quiet, startled gratitude that told her plainly no one had troubled to do that small kindness for him in a very long while. Mrs. Wick noticed it too and said nothing either, though Sadie caught her watching the exchange more than once with an unreadable expression that might have been approval or might have been something considerably more cautious. "You'll want to be careful setting aside plates for hands you fancy," the housekeeper said finally, one evening in November, when the 2 of them were alone scrubbing the last of the pots. "This outfit's seen cooks come and go on account of exactly that kind of fancying, and it never once ends well for the woman doing the fancying, whatever the man might promise her in the dark of a long winter. I'm not fancying anyone, Mrs. Wick. I'm feeding a hand who eats last and cold every night same as the rest, and I find I've got no patience left for watching anyone go hungry when I've got a stove full of heat to spare." Sadie kept scrubbing, though her ears had gone warm at the older woman's plain speaking. "My children are what I'm fancying this winter, and nothing more." Mrs. Wick said nothing further that evening, but her expression, watching Sadie's face, suggested she believed considerably less of that denial than she let show. They fell into an easy, unhurried friendship over the weeks that followed, born of proximity and the particular intimacy of shared hard work through a brutal season. He came early some mornings to help her haul water before the rest of the crew stirred, and stayed late some evenings after the others had gone to the bunkhouse, mending harness by the cookhouse fire while she finished the last of the washing up, and they talked, in the unhurried way of 2 people who had both learned, through hard circumstance, that conversation need not be filled with anything beyond what was actually true. He was good with her children in a way that surprised her, patient with her son Tommy's endless questions about cattle and rope work, gentle with her daughter May's shyness, and Sadie found herself, by December, watching for the particular quality of his attention the way she had once watched for her late husband's step on the porch, though she told herself firmly, each time she caught herself doing it, that a cook had no business setting her heart on a hired hand with nothing more to offer her than the same uncertain winter wage she already drew herself. "You're good with them," she told him one December evening, watching him show Tommy how to properly coil a rope by the fire. "I like children well enough. Never had the chance to raise any of my own." Something quiet and unexamined passed across his face. "This outfit keeps a man too busy for much of a family life, most years." "Is that a complaint, mister?" She realized, saying it, that she still did not know his surname, 3 months into their acquaintance. "I confess I don't believe I ever properly asked your last name." "Briggs," he said after the smallest pause, "though most everyone just calls me Lucas." And Sadie, hearing it, thought nothing more of it at all, because Briggs was a common enough name on that range, and she had no particular reason to connect a quiet hired hand to the outfit's absent, rarely seen owner, whom she had understood, from the crew's occasional idle talk, to be some distant, businesslike figure who left the ranch's daily operation entirely to a foreman and rarely troubled himself with the bunkhouse at all. Christmas came quiet that year. The whole outfit snowed in tight enough that no one could ride to town for the holiday, and Sadie did what she could with the stores on hand. A goose Lucas had shot himself the week before, dried apples worked into a pie, a bread pudding stretched to feed 40 with more patience than ingredients. The crew ate together that evening in a rare loosening of the usual working silence. Stories traded and old songs sung badly and well by turns, and Lucas, for once, did not retreat to the stove the moment his own plate was filled. He sat at the near end of the long table, close enough to Sadie's own seat that she felt his presence like warmth at her shoulder, and he watched her children with an attention that made something in her chest ache with a feeling she was not yet ready to name. Tommy had made him a small carved horse that week, clumsy and lopsided and entirely his own work, whittled with a knife Lucas himself had lent the boy and shown him how to use safely, and the boy presented it after supper with the particular solemn pride of a child who has never quite had a man's attention to spend on him and does not yet trust it will last. "For you," Tommy said, "since you don't have nobody to carve you nothing." Lucas Briggs took the little horse in his scarred hands and turned it over slowly, and Sadie watched something move across his face that was very near to tears, though he did not let them fall in front of the boy. "I'll keep this on my own shelf," he told Tommy. "And I'll tell you, son, it's the finest thing anybody's given me in longer than I care to count." And he meant it so plainly that even May, shy as she was, crept close enough to lean against his knee for the rest of the evening, and Lucas let her stay there, still and careful, as though he were holding something considerably more fragile than a child's ordinary trust. Sadie watched the whole of it from across the table and understood, with a lurch that frightened her rather more than it comforted her, that she had stopped merely liking this quiet hand some weeks before, and had begun, without her own permission, to love him. The trouble that winter came slow and then all at once, the way trouble on a hard-run outfit generally does, and it began with the supply accounts. Sadie had taken to reviewing the cookhouse's provisions ledger in the evenings, out of the same careful habit that had kept her husband's store solvent for 6 years, and by January she had noticed a pattern that troubled her considerably. The flour and salt pork coming up from the Bismarck supplier, ordered and paid for by the ranch's foreman, Ezra Coates, arrived consistently short of what the invoices claimed, and consistently overpriced against what she knew, from her own year's running store, accounts such goods ought reasonably to cost. She said nothing at first, uncertain of her own standing to raise such a question. But by February the shortage had grown serious enough that she brought it, cautiously, to Mrs. Wick. "The flour's come up short 3 months running now, and the invoice price is near double what I paid for the same goods at my husband's store 2 years back. I don't like to make trouble, Mrs. Wick, but a crew this size can't run thin on flour through the rest of a Dakota winter, and I find myself wondering whether the shortage and the overpricing aren't connected somehow." Mrs. Wick's face had gone carefully blank. "That's Mr. Coates's business to manage, not ours, Mrs. Colby. I'd advise you to let it be." I'd let it be if children weren't going to go hungry for it come March, said Sadie. But I find I can't quite manage that particular kind of letting be, not after watching my own children nearly starve the winter my husband died. I mean to speak to someone about it. Star. She spoke to Lucas that same evening, because he was the only person on the outfit she trusted enough to ask, laying out the discrepancy in the ledger with the same careful precision she had once brought to her husband's store books. He read through the figures in silence for a long while, his face going very still. You're certain of these numbers? I kept a mercantile's accounts for 6 years, Lucas. I'm certain she watched him carefully. I don't know who to bring this to. Mrs. Wick as good as told me to let it be, and I don't know the owner well enough to write him directly, whoever he is, and I confess I've never even properly met the man, 3 months into working his outfit. Something moved across Lucas Briggs's face that she could not quite read. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of grim, resigned recognition, as though a suspicion long carried had finally been confirmed. Leave it with me, he said. I'll see it's brought to the right attention. Star. She did not learn the truth for another week, and when it came from Dell, cheerfully oblivious to the weight of what he was telling her, mentioning in passing one morning that the boss had ridden out to Bismarck to settle accounts with the supply house directly. The boss, Sadie repeated slowly. Mr. Briggs, you mean? The owner. Sure, old Lucas himself. Rides out personal when something's gone properly wrong rather than send Coates to smooth it over, which is more than most owners in this territory would trouble themselves to do. Dell did not notice the color draining from her face as he said it. Man owns 40,000 acres and near 400 head and still eats his supper standing at the stove like the rest of us, which I always found a curious thing about him, though I don't suppose curious the word you'd use, ma'am, given the look on your face just now. Star. Sadie found him in the ranch office that same afternoon, going through the supply invoices with Mrs. Wick standing grim-faced at his shoulder, and she stood in the doorway a long moment before either of them noticed her. You own this ranch, she said. All of it. You've owned it the whole time I've been cooking your suppers and setting aside your last plate like you were just another hired hand. And you let me believe otherwise for 3 months. I never told you I wasn't the owner, Sadie. You never told me you were either, which amounts to the same deception dressed up as simple silence. Her voice had gone tight with a mixture of hurt and mortification she could not entirely separate. I have spoken to you these 3 months the way a woman speaks to an equal, Lucas, sharing my worries about my children and my late husband and my whole situation as though we stood on the same ground, and the whole time you were the man who could have solved every one of those worries with a signature, and you let me go on not knowing it. I let you go on not knowing it, Lucas said quietly, because I have spent 11 years since I inherited this outfit watching every person who learns what I own change how they speak to me inside the hour. Watching them measure every word for advantage, watching them stop telling me the truth of anything and start telling me only what they judge I want to hear. You are the first person in 11 years who has spoken to me like a person rather than a fortune, Sadie, and I confess I did not correct your mistake because I could not bear to lose that, even for a single day sooner than I had to. Star. I think I ought to leave, Sadie said, and the words cost her considerably more than she let show. I came here for honest work, and I find I don't know any longer what was honest between us, and what was simply me being fooled by a man too comfortable in his own deception to trouble himself with correcting it. She had already turned toward the door when Lucas Briggs said the thing that stopped her cold. Then take the wages you're owed and take your children, and go wherever you judge best, Sadie. I'll not hold you here against your own will, not for 1 more hour, whatever it costs me to watch you go. His voice was low and entirely without artifice. But before you go, I want you to know the whole of what you'd be leaving, because I find I owe you that honesty at least, however late it comes. I have not eaten a meal at the head of a table in 11 years because I have never once, in all that time, trusted the people sitting at it to want anything from me beyond what my name could get them. I have watched fortune hunters and false friends and men like Coates, who I suspect has been skimming this outfit's supply money for longer than either of us yet knows, and I concluded, somewhere in those 11 years, that the only safe way to live was quiet and last and unremarked, because a man nobody notices is a man nobody troubles to deceive. And then a widow with 2 children and a mercantile's worth of honest arithmetic came into my cookhouse and started setting aside my supper without ever once asking what I was worth, and I found, for the first time in 11 years, that I wanted to be seen properly again, by someone who'd have troubled to see me even if I owned nothing at all. I did not correct your mistake because I was testing you, Sadie. I did not correct it because I was, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, simply happy. Star. Sadie stood very still in the office doorway, her hands still on the frame, turning that over. That is not quite an apology. No, Lucas agreed. It is the truth instead, which I find I owe you a great deal more than an apology at this particular moment. I am sorry for the silence, if the silence wounded you, and I do not think it should have, given how it was meant. But I am not sorry for the 3 months themselves, Sadie, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to smooth over your leaving. Star. She did not leave that day, though she told him plainly she needed time to think, and spent the following week in a careful, watchful distance that cost them both considerably more than either admitted aloud. It was the hardest week of that whole winter, harder in its own way than the grief of her husband's fever had been, because grief at least had the mercy of being simple, a single wound rather than the tangled ache of loving a man and feeling, at the same time, entirely foolish for not having seen what stood plainly in front of her for 3 months. She caught herself, more than once that week, watching him across the cookhouse with the same careful assessment she might once have given a stranger, trying to find in his familiar quiet face some sign of the fortune he had never once mentioned, and finding nothing there but the same weathered kindness she had already come to love before she knew it had a name attached worth 40,000 acres. Tommy noticed the distance before anyone else did, being a child sharp enough to feel the change in a household's weather even when no one troubled to explain it to him. Did Lucas do something wrong, Mama? You don't talk to him at supper no more. It's grown-up business, Tommy, and none of your worry. Sadie smoothed his hair, though the boy's plain question had landed harder than she wanted to admit. I'm only thinking some things through. He gave me his knife to whittle with. He wouldn't do that for somebody he didn't care about. Tommy said it with the flat certainty of a child who has not yet learned that adults complicate simple things far past any child's patience for the complicating. You should just ask him what's wrong instead of thinking so much about it. It was, Sadie reflected later, rather better advice than anything she had managed to work out for herself in a week of careful distance, and it was very nearly word for word what finally sent her to the ranch office to have the whole matter out plainly, rather than let it fester any longer in silence. It was Ezra Coates, cornered at last with the supply ledgers Lucas had confirmed in Bismarck, who broke the standoff between them because his confession, when it finally came, made plain exactly how much Sadie's own honest arithmetic had actually protected the whole outfit through that winter. I've been taking a cut off every order for near 2 years, Coates admitted, when Lucas laid the Bismarck supplier's true invoices against the ranch's own doctored copies. The supplier and I split the overcharge, and I figured a big outfit like this could bear the loss easy enough, and nobody the wiser. I didn't figure on a cook who kept her own husband's storebooks catching the shortfall inside 3 months. She caught what 11 years of my own inattention missed entirely, Lucas said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a grim, settled certainty. You'll be gone from this outfit by morning, Coates, and you'll be fortunate if I don't ride you into Bismarck myself to answer to the sheriff for the theft. Coates did not go quietly, casting one last bitter look toward Sadie on his way out the office door. I don't suppose it occurred to either of you that a cook who reads a man's private ledgers so easily might have her own designs on this outfit, once she'd got the owner's suite on her cooking. That is a considerably uglier suggestion than anything you've actually got proof of, Coates, and I'd advise you to ride out of this territory entirely before you repeat it anywhere I might hear of it a second time, Lucas said, his voice gone flat and dangerous in a way Sadie had not yet heard from him. This woman caught your theft with an honest widow's arithmetic and asked for nothing beyond feeding this crew properly through a hard winter. You'll not leave here spreading a lie about her character to cover the shame of your own. Coates left within the hour, and the story he might have tried to spread never found purchase anywhere in the territory, because Mrs. Wick, who had watched the whole business unfold from close quarters, made certain the true account reached Bismarck before any twisted version of it could. Star. Sadie came to him that same evening, in the ranch office, with the supply ledgers still spread across the desk between them. You said I protected this outfit without knowing what I was protecting, she said. I want you to know I'd have done exactly the same thing whether you owned 400 head or nothing at all, Lucas. because I could not have watched children go hungry over another man's dishonesty and called myself the woman my own father raised. I know it. That is rather the entire point I was trying to make. Badly. A week ago, he came around the desk. I do not want you to stay because you feel you owe me gratitude for the truth finally coming out properly, Sadie. I want you to stay because I have spent 11 years eating alone at the back of a stove, and 3 months eating a meal you troubled to keep warm for me, and I have found I cannot any longer imagine going back to the first arrangement without a very great deal more loss than a hired cook leaving would properly account for. Star. Say the rest of it plainly, Sadie said. I find I have had entirely enough of careful silences this month to last a lifetime. I love you, said Lucas Briggs. I have loved you, I think, since the second week when I found my supper kept warm at the back of your stove and understood, for the first time in 11 years, that someone in this outfit saw me as a man worth the small kindness rather than a fortune worth the courting. I am not asking you to marry an owner, Sadie, because I do not think that is the man you came to know these 3 months. I am asking you to marry the man who eats last because he has never quite believed he deserved to eat first, and who would like, for the whole rest of his life, to learn otherwise from you. Sadie Colby crossed the small distance of that office and put her hand against his weathered face. I fell in love with a quiet hand who mended harness by my fire and taught my son to coil a rope proper, she said. I find the fortune underneath him doesn't change one thing about what I already loved Lucas, except perhaps to make me a little sorry for all the suppers he ate alone before I ever thought to keep one warm. Star. They were married in the spring, once the last snow had cleared off the range, in a small ceremony at the ranch house with the whole crew standing witness, and Dell gave the toast, remarking with considerable good humor that he'd always found it curious a man who owned 40,000 acres ate his supper standing at the stove, and that he supposed now they all knew the whole reason why, that Lucas Briggs had simply been waiting, all those years, for someone to notice him properly before he troubled to sit down. Mrs. Wick cried through the whole ceremony and denied it entirely afterward, and told anyone who would listen that she had known how the whole business would end the very evening she caught Sadie keeping a plate warm at the back of the stove for a hand who ate last, though she grew steadily less believable in the claim with each retelling of it. Star. The following winter, the long table in the Briggs cookhouse had an extra chair added at its head, and Lucas Briggs sat in it most evenings now, though he still kept the old habit, some nights, of standing by the stove a while first, out of a decade's ingrained caution that Sadie had learned not to hurry him out of. You could sit down straight off, you know, she told him one cold evening, watching him linger by the warmth of the stove before finally taking his place at the table beside her and their 2 children, who had come, over the year, to call him something considerably warmer than Mr. Briggs. I could, Lucas agreed, but I find I rather like the standing a moment first these days. It reminds me what the sitting down is actually worth, now that I've got somewhere worth sitting. Sadie kept a plate warm at the back of the stove still, out of long habit, though there was no longer any reason for it, and on the evenings her husband forgot to claim his place quite promptly enough. Their son Tommy had taken to carrying it to him himself, proud of the small responsibility, while May trailed behind insisting on carrying the fork. Star. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where quiet kindness turned out to be worth considerably more than any fortune it concealed, then this story was for you. Out on the Dakota Range, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Lucas Briggs and Sadie Colby became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real, though the whole outfit remembers still and tells it the same way every time, that she kept his supper warm before she ever knew his name was worth knowing at all. If stories of frontier love and quiet, hard-won devotion speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here, the love stories are gentle, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.